Hello and welcome to another episode of Coffee Break Blogging, where this time I am dutifully drinking a cup of coffee. I don't remember what kind of coffee it was. It was something that I bought. It was organic, and I did have to reheat it in the microwave. So that might have been a faux pas, but what you're going to do? I have to have a cup of coffee while I'm recording the podcast. Anyway, speaking of podcast, that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today, podcasting. Now, we're talking here, the general theme of this big set of episodes that we're doing right now on this podcast is about getting traffic to our sites. And there's no doubt that a podcast can serve as a good audience building and traffic getting vehicle. And perhaps you've learned and heard a lot about podcasting, and maybe you've thought about getting a podcast of your own, starting up your own podcast. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this question of, should you start your own podcast? Now, the first thing that I want to do is look at a few stats. Now, before I hit the record button, I went out and looked at a few stats to see where podcasting is today, because I've been hearing about how we're kind of in a golden age of podcasting right now, how there's a lot of growth in podcasting. And I've experienced it because I'm definitely seeing growth in this particular show, but I hadn't really looked at the stats much to see what was actually happening collectively. So I went out and looked around. There was a company out there, their name is Edison Research, and they dropped a few stats. One was that in the last 7 years, the percentage of Americans who listen to podcasts has almost doubled. I think it started out around 7 or 9%. It's up to like 17 or something like that, like regularly listen to podcasts. So it's definitely gone up. Now, 33% of all Americans have listened to at least one podcast. Now, that's pretty good because this is a medium that started out where it was basically just the really geeky types. It used to be like a technical thing, and you had to kind of be in the know to listen to podcasts. Well, now it's changing. It's become a lot more accessible, and today a third of all Americans have actually listened to at least one podcast. So that's definitely an uptick. About 50% of Americans are aware of podcasts. Now, again, looking at it as the medium coming from a really geeky background. I mean, it used to be like going up to somebody and talking about an RSS feed, and their eyes would cross and just like bad things would happen. They would have no idea what you're talking about. And to this day, with an RSS feed, that's the way most people are. You know, a veteran blogger might know what an RSS feed is, but most people don't. And that's the way podcasting began. You had to know what the RSS feed was. You had to plug it into a little app, blah, blah, blah. So the fact that we've gone from that dorky, geeky point to now today that 50% of Americans actually know what it is, that's actually a really big uptick. Now, obviously, we still have 50% of us left, but that's a really big uptick. Now, Americans have now listened to 21.1 million hours of podcast per day. Now, that's a boatload of podcasting. 21.1 million hours of podcasting per day. Now, another study that I saw, it's called the Share of Ear Study. This was put out by Edison Research. They looked at the amount of time that people spend listening to various forms of audio in any format, and they looked at the breakdown. And 25.9% of that total time spent listening to audio was spent listening to podcast. 25.9%. Now, just to put this into perspective, if you think that that's not a big number, 27.5% was spent listening to AM/FM radio. So we're talking listening to music, listening to talk radio, whatever it might be. The entire collective listening to the radio, podcasting is just a hair behind the amount of people that are listening to the radio. Now, here's another interesting one. 22.3% of that time listening to audio was spent listening to music that they actually own. So in this case, we're talking about CDs, things like that. people just aren't, I guess the amount of time that they spend listening to music has dropped. And so 25.9% listening to podcasts, it's really up there. When it comes to people who listen to audio regularly, it is now a major, major player. Now let's look over to Libsyn. Now Libsyn is a hosting company specifically for podcasting. And in fact, this very podcast, along with millions of others, is hosted with Libsyn. Now Libsyn came out with a stat that said in 2014, which is just last year, there were 2.6 billion podcast downloads. That's billion with a B. That's a big number. 2.6 billion podcast downloads. And that's just from Libsyn, because there obviously are other, places where people host their podcasts, but Libsyn happens to be the biggie. Now, of those 2.6 billion podcast downloads, here's an interesting thing. 63% of them were from mobile devices. Now that's huge, and that goes to a really big key point in how and why podcasting is growing quickly these days. Because we've got a very rapid increase of mobile device usage. This is why when it comes to the web and our blogs, we have to pay so much attention to mobile responsiveness and what our sites look like and how they act on mobile. Mobile is a pretty big thing, and it's definitely created a really big uptick in the world of podcasting. And when we were relegated to our desktop computers to listen to this stuff, it made it a lot less useful. Now that we can bring podcasting with us to the gym, in the car, things like that, it means that it's so much easier to listen to podcasts. Makes it a lot more accessible. Not only that, in the world of iOS, which is the Apple operating system for the iPhone and the iPad, the podcast app is now a standalone app, and it's now standard on iOS. It wasn't always like that, okay? Now there's a podcast app just sitting right there. And so obviously that increases a lot of awareness as well. And the other thing is that we're seeing more cars come out with built-in connectivity to podcasting. Things like, being able to access podcasts right from the car without even having to plug their phone in. It's just right from the car. Now, so that really puts podcasting on par with radio, which of course, if we back up to the Edison Research study, statistically speaking, it really is on par with the radio. It's right up there with people that listen to the darn radio. So podcasting has grown a lot. It really has reached a really substantial point, and I think it's going to go higher from here because people we want more choices in our content. Well, podcasting gives that, okay? The other great thing that people love is the fact that, yes, podcasts are free, and that's a great thing, right? So for many, many reasons, and a lot of statistics, yes, podcasting is a pretty big thing. Now, this all comes down to the original question, and that is, should you start one? Should you personally get in on this wave of podcasting so that you can write it as it grows further? Now, numerically speaking, the answer would be yes. Statistically speaking, it would be yes. It would be like getting in on the World Wide Web back in the 90s, which I did actually. Now, it was a lot easier to grow a site back then than it is today. And in many ways, podcasting is in that situation right now. There's a lot of rapid growth going on. Now, you can't just start a podcast and it's going to be like, willy-nilly easy to grow it. It's already reached past that point. But numerically speaking, there's still a lot of growth potential to podcasting as a medium. Now, the second question, and this is why we need to ask this question of ourselves, is podcasting really the right fit for you? Do you have what it takes to actually get in on it? The last thing that you want to do is start a podcast just because the numbers make it seem very attractive, but then you crash and burn because you didn't really have a plan of action. So we got to ask ourselves a few questions here at the outset. First one is, do you have something to say? Now that's important. Can you actually hop behind a microphone and go for it for however long you plan to have your episodes be? If the last thing that you want to do is start out with a bang, thinking you've got such a great idea, then after 2 or 3 episodes, you're kind of like, you're done. You don't really have anywhere else to go. You don't want to go there. That's not what you want to do. So you got to ask yourself the honest question. Do you have something to say? Do you have something to add to the world? Another question you want to ask yourself is, do you have a reason to start a podcast? You don't want to start a podcast only because there's lots of growth. You got to have a strategy in mind. What are you doing the podcast for? Are you going to direct your listeners into something? I can tell you straight up, the reason that I do coffee break blogging, there's 2 things. One is I wanted to provide value to the world of podcast in the format that I do it. I didn't believe that there was anybody who was doing a purely instructional, tactical podcast like this. Most people were doing primarily interviews. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. Secondly, though, let's be honest, I'm doing it to promote my business as well. I mean, I would not do it otherwise. I mean, I do this for a living. So therefore, when I promote something at the end of the podcast or what have you, I'm really hoping that all of you guys who are listening right now are going to go check out what I said, because it is a promotional medium. So, but in order for it to be used as a promotional medium, you've got to have somewhere to go. You've got to have something to promote in the first place. And so you got to ask yourself, what is your reason for starting a podcast? Now, another very important question that you need to ask yourself is, can you actually be regular about it? You've got to be consistent with a podcast. And in fact, my biggest mistake with this podcast at the beginning was being irregular. This podcast did not start out as Coffee Break Blogging. It started out as one called the Blog Program. And in fact, if you go back to the first 30 episodes of this particular podcast, it is called the Blog Program. Very different thing than what I do now. Now, the problem with the Blog Program is that I essentially let it die. I let it die. And it was because I became irregular about it. And so I'm just telling you with experience, and any other podcaster will tell you the same thing. You don't want to start a podcast unless you know that you can actually be regular about it. It's important. You got to have a plan. You got to be able to, if you're going to do like a once a week episode, you got to be consistent once a week. Now, here's another question you need to ask of yourself, and you just got to be honest about it. Are you good on the medium? Are you good at speaking? Now, I'll be honest, you'll get better at it over time. I do not put myself out there as an expert podcaster or as an expert speaker. Quite frankly, I think I'm a better writer than probably a speaker. Now, maybe you've got a different opinion. I don't know. But the thing is, you will get better at it over time. But you need to ask yourself, can you do this type of thing? Can you speak for a certain block of time and do it with some, smoothness to you without having a bunch of ums and ahs and that kind of thing throughout? Because that's going to be really difficult to listen to and people won't do it. So are you good on the medium? So here's the thing. Should you start a podcast of your own? Only you can answer that question. But there is a plan of action here. Now, the next few episodes of this show, we are going to be talking about podcasting. That'll be the general theme of the next few episodes here. But I encourage you not to rush into podcasting without a plan. The first thing that you want to do is really nail down the concept that you plan to bring to the table with your podcast. What is the big idea? When I started out this podcast, under the Blog Program name, I can't say that I had a really solid plan. And that was part of what made it become irregular, because I started, quite frankly, running out of ideas. Now, when I relaunched it as the Coffee Break Blogging Podcast, I had a very solid plan. I knew exactly what I was going to do. And in fact, I actually went out in my RV and I spent a time by myself with no kids there, nice and quiet. It's a beautiful thing. And I planned out this exact podcast all the way out through the end of the year. So as it sits right now, I know exactly what I'm going to be talking about on Coffee Break Blogging up through the end of this year, up through episode 146, I think it is. Something like that. Now, you need to have a plan. So you got to have an idea, and then you've got to be able to plan that thing out for quite some time, because that's going to be a big tool in your arsenal when it comes to your ability to remain consistent. If you are struggling with what to say on your own podcast, that's going to be rough. It's going to be rough. The third thing, and I'll mention here before we end off, is that you want to put some time into systematizing things so that you can actually produce podcast episodes fairly quickly without a whole lot of confusion. Now, the first few episodes are going to be a little odd because you're still getting used to your equipment. You've got to maybe get the equipment to begin with, getting used to your audio program, what have you. But you want to get to a point pretty quickly where you can systematize it and really make it to where it doesn't take a lot of time. Okay? And you can use VAs and all that stuff, but it doesn't really matter. You can actually do it all yourself. The big thing is not to make the show so overly complicated that you can't do it yourself. Don't think that you've got to make your show sound like some magic Hollywood production and that you're going to spend so much time on it yourself trying to get it to that point that you're ultimately going to hate it. Okay? So keep your show to something where you can put them out there on a regular pattern, that it doesn't take too much work on your part. Make sure it sounds good. Your audio quality is very important. But otherwise, don't overcomplicate it with a bunch of different segments and all this stuff. You can actually make simple podcasts that are still valuable and easy to listen to. Okay? So that is my quasi-answer to should you start a podcast of your own. Statistically speaking, yes, this is a good time to start a podcast, but you've got to ask yourself a few honest questions on whether the medium is the best fit for you. Now, I'm going to end off this episode by letting you know about one of the courses that I have inside the Blog Monetization Lab. This one is simply called Finding Your Niche. Now, the reason I bring this up, especially right now, is because if you're going to start a podcast, you obviously have to start out with a solid idea. Now, the idea of starting up of finding your niche obviously goes very heavily into starting a blog in the first place. But it's very, very important when it comes to starting a podcast as well. You need to have a niche. Now, I mentioned earlier that what I came in with the idea of coffee break blogging. It wasn't just, my niche is blogging, because that would be way too vague. I came into it with a little bit more in mind and with what's called a unique selling proposition in mind. I had to have an angle, okay? And that's the kind of stuff that we do talk about inside Finding Your Niche. Now, Finding Your Niche also gets into some of the classic things that you need to go through, like keyword research and stuff, into determining if there's legs in a particular market. But then I also guide you through some questions so that you can actually evaluate that market also from a psychological basis and also from a business basis to really see if it's going to have legs for you. And it works just as well in the world of podcasting and determining your niche as you come into this medium as it would with your blog. So the Finding Your Niche course is available only in the Blog Monetization Lab. And you can, of course, learn more about that at blogmonetizationlab.com. Okay, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.